Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're putting on our hard hats and acting as system architects. We're going to completely look past the historical figures and the famous names you'd normally associate with this topic. Instead, we are zeroing in on the purely mechanical structure, the actual institutional blueprint of Islamic governance. We're talking about the cogs, the gears, and the strict structural flow of power that literally defines this entire system. No people today, just the machine itself. So, to kick off our architectural review, let's pose our central question. Does an Islamic state actually have branches of government? We really want to explore exactly how this theoretical machine maps onto the governing concepts we already understand in modern political philosophy. Like, do the structures we completely take for granted today exist in this historical framework? Let's find out. Okay, let's dive right into a universally understood baseline of political philosophy, the trias politica. You know, the concept we usually associate with the French philosopher Montesquieu, dividing government into three branches. You've got the executive implementing laws, the legislative making laws, and the judicial interpreting them and resolving disputes. Now, as the source material points out, these three distinct functions of power exist across almost every ruling system in human history. And that absolutely includes the Islamic system, though as you'll see, they differ wildly in their degree of separation. Here is our clean, people-free organizational chart for today. 1. The separation of powers. 2. The ultimate legislative framework. 3. The executive social contract. 4. Strict judicial independence. And 5. A unique structural balance. Section 1. The separation of powers. When we compare the two, the contrast is fascinating. In the U.S. democratic system, you have this strict institutional separation on paper, right? But as modern scholars often note, it gets a bit blurred in reality, like when a president issues executive orders that basically act as new laws. But the Islamic blueprint, it approaches this totally differently. According to jurists like El-Senhuri, you don't actually have a complete separation between the executive and judicial branches, because, well, the executive appoints the judges. But and this is a huge but, there is a massive, impenetrable wall between those two branches and the legislative power. The law is a completely separate entity. Section 2. The ultimate legislative framework. All right, brace yourselves, because here is arguably the biggest plot twist in this entire constitutional blueprint. Legislation in this system is not produced by an assembly of people. I mean, think about that. In this framework, the legislative branch is the Sharia itself. It's the absolute supreme moral law. It's not a human institution, not a parliament, not a Congress hashing out bills. It's a pre-existing, divine legal framework that strictly binds the state and completely limits the powers of whoever happens to be holding the executive office, literally stopping them from overstepping the law. This really hits the nail on the head. This quote from C.A. Nalino, a professor of the history and institutions of Islam, confirms that while these universal monarchs possessed limitless executive and judicial reach, they were completely destitute of legislative powers. The legal code was fixed. An executive couldn't just invent a new law to serve their own political agenda. The administration of the state had to be brought into harmony with the dictates of this sacred law, not the other way around. So the crucial takeaway here is that the legislative framework is completely, 100% insulated from executive manipulation or human production. The technical term for this concept is sidada, or sovereignty, and in this mechanical model, sovereignty belongs exclusively to the Sharia. Meaning, if an executive even attempted to impose a law outside of this framework, or say commanded something that violated it, the underlying social contract would just shatter. The masses would actually be absolved from obeying that specific command. The whole system is engineered to reject unauthorized legislative inputs. Section 3. The executive social contract. Now, it's brilliant how we can map out the mechanical transfer of power from the masses to the state apparatus via a strict social contract. It's a clean, three-step process. Step 1, the ummah, or the broader community, acts as the ultimate source of authority. Step 2, they utilize a mechanism called the bay'ah, which is basically a binding constitutional contract. And step 3, through this contract, executive ruling power is transferred and formally vested into a unitary executive post, the Caliph. It's actually remarkably similar in structure to Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which vests all executive power into a single president. But here is where it gets interesting. While the unitary executive post holds incredibly broad administrative authority, it is fundamentally subordinate to the supreme legislative framework. When we look at the balance of powers and limits, it's pretty clear. On the power side, the executive is the general guardian, completely responsible for managing the subject's affairs. But when it comes to limits, that power is not unconditional. It is strictly bound by the Bea Contract to rule solely by the predetermined legislative constitution. They are strictly an executor of the law, not a creator of it. So how do you actually run a machine this massive? While the executive delegates authority to a highly structured bureaucracy of administrative representatives. These delegates, known as wukala, were mathematically categorized by jurists like al-Mawardi. Just think about this elegant interlocking matrix of delegation. You've got officials with general powers over all provinces, like wazirs. Then general powers in specific provinces, like emirs. Specific powers across all provinces, like chief judges or military commanders. And finally, specific powers in specific districts, like local judges or tax collectors. It's a highly flexible but deeply structured governing matrix, designed specifically to scale. Section 4. Strict judicial independence. Okay, here is where we really see the system's structural tension in action. As we mentioned earlier, the executive absolutely has the prerogative to appoint and dismiss the judges. So purely mechanically speaking, the judiciary is not entirely independent of the executive. But, and this is key, this subordination has almost no practical importance when it actually comes to rendering a verdict. Why? Because once appointed, both the executive and the judge must bow solely before the legislative power, the law itself. Historically and theoretically, this decisional independence ensures the executive office enjoys absolutely no special immunity from the courts. Decisional independence is a massive component of this machine. It means the judicial apparatus evaluates a case totally free from media pressure, politics, or executive meddling, and decides the outcome strictly based on the legal code. In fact, there are well-documented historical instances where the highest executive in the state was taken to court by an ordinary citizen, and the judge, who was appointed by that very executive, mind you, ruled against the head of state. The system is fundamentally designed to allow the law to override executive rank. And this perfectly illustrates our point. As academic Wael Halak points out, Islamic governments separated the executive power from the legislative by degrees, making the former wholly subservient to the will of the latter. Basically, the legislative framework is essentially weaponized to keep the executive branch in check. The judiciary enforces this subservience. In this specific blueprint, the system is highly functional because the law is supreme, completely unalterable by the ruler, and universally applied by the courts. Section 5. A unique structural balance. Let's pull all these interlocking cogs together. The ultimate realization here is that structural balance relies on an overarching legislative power that rules over every single administrative and judicial organ. Modern states often rule over and heavily regulate their legal institutions, bending them to political will. But in this blueprint, the dynamic is totally inverted. The legislative framework is unrivaled. It regulates all secular institutions either directly or through delegation. Because there's no judicial review that can rewrite the law, and absolutely no executive order that can override it. True separation of powers is achieved through the absolute supremacy of the legislative code over the people actually operating the machine. So, I'm going to leave you with a final provocative thought. We've mapped out a system built on a rigid, supreme legislative framework that sits entirely above the executive and judicial branches. How does this theoretical balance of absolute legislative supremacy compare to the fluid, shifting structures of modern democracies, where executives make laws and legislatures bend with the political wind? It's a truly fascinating lens for viewing how different institutional blueprints try to solve the ultimate puzzle of separating powers. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring these structural blueprints.